she can't even get in the car alone anymore. The words sliced through the cold Chicago evening air like a blade through flesh, each syllable dripping with the casual cruelty that only comes from someone who has forgotten your humanity. My son Marcus whispered it to his wife Sarah, thinking I couldn't hear, but the parking lot acoustics carried his shame-filled assessment of my worth directly to my ears. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. I stood frozen beside the silver Honda Civic I had purchased with my own Social Security savings, my arthritic fingers trembling as they reached for the door handle that suddenly felt as heavy as a tombstone. The woman who had once driven herself across 3 states to be at his college graduation, who had navigated the chaotic streets of downtown Chicago to bring him homemade soup when he had the flu, was now reduced to a whispered punchline between husband and wife. Sarah's perfectly manicured fingers covered her mouth as she stifled a laugh, her designer coat a stark contrast to my worn winter jacket with its missing button that I'd been meaning to replace for months. Her eyes held that particular brand of pity mixed with impatience that I'd grown accustomed to seeing in my son's home, the look of people who view you as a burden they're graciously choosing to bear. The wind cut through the parking lot of Giuseppe's Italian restaurant, where we'd just finished what Marcus called our monthly family dinner, though it felt more like a quarterly performance where I played the grateful grandmother who should be thankful for any scraps of attention thrown her way. I had offered to pay, as I always did, watching Marcus's eyes light up with the same greedy satisfaction I'd seen when he was 6 years old, and I'd given him my last piece of chocolate. "Mom, you're moving too slow," Marcus said, his voice carrying that edge of frustrated tolerance that had become his default tone when addressing me. At 38, he'd inherited his father's impatience, but none of his father's underlying warmth. His designer watch, the one I'd helped him buy for his promotion, caught the streetlight as he checked the time with theatrical exasperation. I fumbled with the car door, my fingers still stiff from the Chicago cold that seemed to seep deeper into my bones each winter. 73 years of life had taught me many things, but nothing had prepared me for the moment when your own child begins to see you as a project to manage rather than a person to love. "Just let me help you," Sarah said, stepping forward with the kind of forced patience nurses use with difficult patients. Her voice carried that saccharine sweetness that barely masked her irritation, the tone of someone performing kindness for an audience rather than offering it from the heart. But as her hands reached toward me, I heard it again, that whispered assessment that revealed how they truly saw me. Not as Dorothy Chen, the woman who had worked double shifts at the nursing home to put Marcus through Northwestern University. Not as the mother who had sold her wedding ring to help with his down payment on the Lincoln Park townhouse, where I now lived in the converted basement. Not as the grandmother who babysat Emma and Jake every weekend, so they could have their date nights. I was simply the old woman who can't even get in the car alone anymore. The basement apartment where I'd lived for the past 18 months had become my entire world, a cramped space beneath their perfect family life, where I could hear their footsteps above me like a constant reminder of my displacement. The ceiling was so low that my late husband Robert would have had to duck, and the single window looked out onto their garbage cans and the alley where delivery trucks rumbled past at dawn. My bedroom was really just a sectioned-off corner with a curtain for privacy, containing my single bed, the dresser I'd brought from my old house, and the rocking chair where Robert used to read me the newspaper on Sunday mornings. The kitchen was a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a microwave on a card table, where I prepared simple meals that I ate alone while listening to the sounds of family dinner happening upstairs. Every morning, I woke to the sound of Marcus and Sarah getting the children ready for school, Emma's laughter mixing with Jake's protests about wearing his coat, Sarah's gentle corrections about brushing teeth properly, Marcus calling out reminders about lunch money and soccer practice. It was the soundtrack of a family life that I existed alongside, but was no longer truly part of. I had become the live-in babysitter who worked for room and board, the unpaid housekeeper who tidied up after their dinner parties, the convenient grandmother who was always available but never truly appreciated. When they needed me, I was Mom, or Grandma Dorothy. When they didn't, I was simply an obligation they had inherited along with the house and the comfortable life my sacrifices had helped them build. The monthly dinners at Giuseppe's had become our ritual of pretending we were still a close family, though they felt more like supervised visits between a prisoner and relatives who had run out of things to say. Marcus would order the most expensive items on the menu while discussing his latest promotion at the consulting firm. Sarah would share updates about her yoga classes and book club, and I would smile and nod and offer to pay the check that always seemed to grow larger each month. But tonight, as I stood in that parking lot hearing my own inadequacy discussed like a medical condition, something cracked inside my chest. Not my heart, that had been slowly fracturing for months, but something deeper. My sense of dignity, perhaps. My last remaining belief that I still mattered to the people I had sacrificed everything to love. The ride home was silent except for Sarah's soft music playing through the car speakers. Some contemporary artist singing about independence and self-love, words that felt like mockery given my current circumstances. I sat in the back seat like a child being driven to school, watching the familiar streets of Chicago blur past the window as we headed back to the house where I would disappear into my basement apartment, and they would continue their lives upstairs, as if I had never existed. As we pulled into their driveway, I saw the garbage cans I would need to drag to the curb tomorrow morning, the snow-covered walkway I would need to shovel before Emma and Jake left for school, the dried leaves still scattered across their front lawn that I would rake this weekend while they attended Jake's hockey tournament in the suburbs. My invisible labor that kept their comfortable life running smoothly, performed by the woman who can't even get in the car alone anymore. Marcus didn't walk me to my basement entrance that night. Neither did Sarah. They simply called out goodnight from the main house as I made my way down the narrow concrete steps to my door, my keys jingling in the darkness as I let myself into the space that had become both my shelter and my prison. That night, I sat in my rocking chair, holding the framed photograph of Robert that I kept on my nightstand, and whispered into the darkness, "Was I used, my love? Did I give away so much of myself that there's nothing left they consider worth keeping?" The silence that answered me felt heavier than any words could have been. The morning after Giuseppe's, I sat in my basement kitchen with a cup of instant coffee, staring at the stack of financial documents I kept in an old shoebox. Receipts, bank statements, and canceled checks that told the story of a mother who had given everything and received whispered mockery in return. Each piece of paper was evidence of my foolishness, proof that love could be measured in dollars and still amount to nothing. The Northwestern University tuition payments, $47,000 per year for 4 years. I had worked 16-hour shifts at Mercy General's nursing home, my feet swelling in white shoes that never seemed to fit properly, my back aching from lifting patients who outweighed me by 50 pounds. I'd eat peanut butter sandwiches for lunch, while Marcus called from his dorm to complain about the quality of the campus dining hall food. "Mom, the cafeteria is disgusting," he'd say during our weekly phone calls. "All my friends eat at the restaurants near campus. Could you maybe send some extra money?" And I would, skipping my own meals to wire him another $100 so he wouldn't feel embarrassed among his wealthy classmates, who drove cars newer than any I'd ever owned. The wedding expenses, $28,000 for Sarah and Marcus's dream wedding at the Palmer House Hilton. I had cashed out my retirement account early, paying the penalties and taxes that left me with barely enough to cover my own rent that month. But Marcus had wanted to impress Sarah's parents, wanted to prove he could provide the kind of life their daughter deserved. I remember standing in the bridal shop on Michigan Avenue, watching Sarah try on dresses that cost more than my monthly Social Security check, while her mother made comments about keeping things elegant and not going overboard. Code words that everyone understood meant they expected Marcus's family to pay for elegance they couldn't afford. "Dorothy, you must be so proud," Sarah's mother had said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that wealthy people mistake for graciousness. "Marcus is such a catch. Sarah is so lucky." The implication was clear. My son was punching above his weight, and I should be grateful that their daughter had chosen to marry him. The house down payment, $35,000 from the sale of the small bungalow where Robert and I had lived for 37 years. The house where Marcus had learned to ride his bicycle in the narrow hallway, where we'd celebrated every birthday and Christmas with more love than money. I sold it without hesitation when Marcus explained that Sarah wouldn't marry him unless he could offer her a proper home in a good neighborhood. "Mom, you understand, right?" he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes as we signed the papers that transferred my life savings into his bank account. "Sarah's used to a certain standard of living. Her parents would never respect me if I couldn't provide for her properly." I had nodded and smiled, telling myself that this was what mothers did. They built foundations for their children's happiness, even if it meant demolishing their own security in the process. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Humboldt Park, convincing myself that downsizing was liberating, that I didn't need much space now that Robert was gone. The credit card bills, $12,000 to furnish their Lincoln Park townhouse with the kind of furniture that impressed Sarah's book club friends, Restoration Hardware dining sets, West Elm sofas, Pottery Barn everything. I charged it all to the cards I'd never used during my marriage, telling myself I'd pay it off gradually with my part-time income from the nursing home. But part-time work at 70 wasn't the same as the full-time employment I'd maintained in my 60s. My energy flagged, my shifts were reduced, and the monthly minimum payments grew larger while my paycheck grew smaller. I started buying generic groceries, cutting coupons with the desperation of someone who'd never needed them before, wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation because new clothes had become an impossible luxury. The babysitting arrangement that wasn't supposed to be an arrangement. "Mom, could you just watch Emma and Jake this weekend? Sarah has a work retreat, and I have that conference in Milwaukee." What started as occasional favors became my entire social calendar. Every Friday night, every weekend, every school holiday when other grandparents were playing golf or taking cruises, I was changing diapers and mediating sibling arguments and falling asleep in front of the television while Marcus and Sarah lived their lives. Emma was 7 now, with Sarah's blonde hair and Marcus's stubborn streak. Jake was 5, all energy and scraped knees and questions I didn't always have answers for. I loved them desperately, completely, but I began to realize that my love was being used as unpaid labor rather than celebrated as a gift. "Grandma Dorothy's here again," Emma would announce when I arrived on Friday afternoons, her tone suggesting that my presence was as predictable and unremarkable as the sunrise. Not excitement, not joy, just acknowledgement that the free babysitter had arrived for another weekend of service. The emergency loan for Marcus's car repair, $3,800 when his BMW needed transmission work and he couldn't afford to be without transportation during an important client presentation week. I borrowed against my credit cards to get him the cash immediately, watching him drive away in his freshly repaired luxury vehicle while I waited at the bus stop because my own 15-year-old Corolla had failed inspection and I couldn't afford the repairs. "I'll pay you back next month, Mom," he'd promised. But next month became next quarter, which became, "as soon as this big commission comes through," which eventually became silence whenever I gently mentioned the money I'd lent him. The medical bills when I'd fallen in my studio apartment and broken my wrist, $2,400 that insurance didn't cover. I'd called Marcus from the emergency room, hoping he might come sit with me during the long wait for x-rays and treatment. Instead, he'd sent a text, "Hope you feel better soon, Mom. Sarah and I have dinner plans, but call if it's really serious." I'd sat alone in that sterile waiting room for 6 hours, my wrist throbbing and my heart breaking as I watched other families gather around their injured relatives. Young couples holding hands in solidarity, adult children consulting with doctors about their parents' care, grandchildren bringing balloons and worried hugs to their hospitalized grandparents. When the doctor finally set my cast and released me at nearly midnight, I took a taxi home to my empty apartment and realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become financially useful but emotionally expendable to the only family I had left. The move to Marcus and Sarah's basement, presented as a solution to our mutual problems. "Mom, you're spending too much on rent, and we could really use help with the kids. It's perfect. You'll save money, and we'll have built-in childcare. Win-win." But win-win implied that both parties gained something of value, and I quickly discovered that my gains were minimal while my losses multiplied daily. I saved on rent, but lost my privacy. I gained proximity to my grandchildren, but lost my independence. I provided free childcare but received no recognition for the professional-level service I delivered. My days became an endless rotation of invisible labor, packing school lunches while Marcus read the financial news on his phone, doing loads of laundry that somehow never included my own clothes, cleaning bathrooms that I barely used while the upstairs bathrooms, the ones the family actually used, remained my responsibility as well. Dorothy's so helpful, Sarah would tell her friends when they gathered for wine and complaints about their own childcare expenses. We're so lucky to have her. But luck implied chance, and there was nothing accidental about the way they'd systematically arranged their lives to benefit from my labor while minimizing their own efforts. The birthday that broke something inside me, my 73rd, 3 months before that night at Giuseppe's. I woke up in my basement bedroom to silence. No cards, no calls, no acknowledgement that the woman who'd remembered every birthday in their family for decades had reached another milestone of her own. I waited all day, checking my phone obsessively, jumping every time I heard footsteps on the floor above me. Surely Marcus would remember. Surely the children would ask about Grandma's special day. Surely someone would notice that I'd been alive for 73 years, and that this fact deserved some small celebration. But dinner time came and went, with no mention of my birthday. Bath time, bedtime stories, the evening routine that I'd helped establish and maintain. All of it proceeded normally while I sat in my basement, wondering if I'd somehow become so invisible that even my own existence had ceased to matter. At 9:47 p.m., as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry, crazy day. We'll celebrate this weekend." This weekend never came. Like so many of his promises, it evaporated into the busyness that seemed to consume every moment that might have been dedicated to showing me that I still mattered. That night, lying in my narrow bed beneath their comfortable family life, I whispered the question that had been growing louder in my mind for months. Was I used, Robert? Did I give so much that they forgot I was supposed to be loved, not just utilized? The answer seemed to echo in every unpaid bill, every unacknowledged sacrifice, every moment of labor that had been accepted as my natural obligation rather than celebrated as my generous gift. Was I used? The evidence was overwhelming, and it was destroying me one whispered insult at a time. The microaggressions began as tiny paper cuts that accumulated into gaping wounds over the months following my forgotten birthday. It started with Sarah's new habit of speaking about me in third person while I stood right there, as if my presence was so insignificant that acknowledging it directly would be a waste of energy. "Marcus, your mother left dishes in the sink again," she'd announce while I stood 3 feet away, drying my hands on the kitchen towel. Not, "Dorothy left dishes" or "she left dishes," but "your mother," as if I'd been reduced to nothing more than Marcus's inherited responsibility. A problem he'd failed to properly manage. "Maybe we should put up a note about kitchen rules," Sarah continued, her voice carrying that particular brand of passive-aggressive sweetness that wealthy women perfect in finishing school. Some people forget that shared spaces require consideration for others. I wanted to remind her that the dishes were the breakfast plates I'd washed for Emma and Jake before walking them to the bus stop, that I'd been cleaning kitchens since before she was born, that the woman she was discussing like a poorly trained domestic worker had paid for half the appliances she was protecting. Instead, I mumbled an apology and retreated to my basement, my cheeks burning with the shame of being scolded like a child in front of my own grandchildren. The children began to mirror their parents' attitude with the casual cruelty that only comes naturally to those who've never been taught to question their privilege. Emma started rolling her eyes when I offered to help with her homework, sighing dramatically as if my assistance was more burden than benefit. "Grandma Dorothy, you don't understand the new math," she'd say, her 7-year-old voice carrying an exasperation that sounded disturbingly like her mother's tone. "They don't teach it the old way anymore. Maybe just sit over there?" Jake, barely 5 years old, had learned to ignore me entirely unless he needed something. He'd walk past me in the hallway as if I were furniture, never making eye contact, never offering the spontaneous hugs that had once made all my sacrifices feel worthwhile. When he wanted a snack or help reaching something, he'd call for Mom or Dad, completely bypassing the grandmother who spent more time caring for him than either of his parents. The dinner table conversations became exercises in exclusion. carefully orchestrated to remind me that I was audience rather than participant in their family life. Marcus would discuss his work projects in detail. Sarah would share gossip from her book club. The children would chatter about school friends and weekend plans, while I sat silent, invisible, occasionally asked to pass the salt, but never invited to contribute to the conversation. Emma's teacher thinks she should try piano lessons, Sarah announced one evening, cutting her organic chicken with precise, delicate movements. There's a wonderful instructor in Lincoln Park who charges $200 per lesson, but it's an investment in her cultural development. $200 per lesson. More than my weekly grocery budget, casually discussed as if it were pocket change, while I calculated whether I could afford to replace my worn-out winter boots before the snow got worse. That sounds perfect, Marcus replied, not even glancing in my direction despite knowing that I'd taught piano for 15 years before Marcus was born, that I'd given lessons in our old house to supplement Robert's income, that I could teach Emma everything she needed to know for free if anyone had bothered to remember that I existed as more than their unpaid babysitter. But my expertise wasn't valuable because it didn't cost anything. My decades of experience meant nothing because they couldn't brag to their friends about hiring me. I was the family's best-kept secret, the grandmother who provided professional-level childcare, housekeeping, and educational support without the prestige of having paid for it. The breaking point came on a February morning when Chicago's wind felt sharp enough to slice skin. I'd been battling a persistent cough for 2 weeks, the kind of deep chest congestion that comes from living in a basement with poor ventilation during the city's harshest season. But Marcus and Sarah had a weekend getaway planned to Milwaukee's Grand Geneva Resort, and asking them to postpone seemed impossible, given how much they'd already spent on the non-refundable reservation. "Mom, you'll be fine," Marcus had said when I mentioned feeling unwell. "It's probably just allergies. Emma and Jake are easy kids. They practically take care of themselves." But that Friday night, as my cough turned into something that made breathing difficult, I realized I was running a fever. My forehead felt hot and clammy. My body ached with the deep bone tiredness that signals serious illness, and my chest felt tight with congestion that seemed to be getting worse by the hour. I called Marcus's cell phone at 11:30 p.m., my hands shaking as I dialed the number. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "Mom? What's wrong? It's almost midnight." "Marcus, I think I need to go to the emergency room," I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly would trigger another coughing fit. "I can't breathe properly, and I think I have a fever." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Then I heard Sarah's voice in the background. "Is she serious? We just got here. The spa appointments are non-refundable." "Mom," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the weary patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Can't you just take some cough medicine? Maybe drink some tea? We're 2 hours away, and we've already paid for everything here." "I don't think this is something tea can fix," I managed to say before another coughing fit seized me, harsh and painful enough that I had to grip the kitchen counter to stay upright. "Look, Mom, if it's really that serious, call 911, or take an Uber to the hospital. But honestly, you're probably just being dramatic because you're scared to watch the kids alone. You've done this 100 times before." Dramatic. The word hit me like a physical blow, reducing my genuine medical crisis to attention-seeking behavior from a needy old woman who couldn't handle a simple babysitting job. "But the children?" I started to say. "They'll be fine. They're asleep. Just try to get some rest, and we'll deal with whatever this is when we get back Sunday night." The line went dead, leaving me standing in their kitchen at midnight, fevering and struggling to breathe, with 2 sleeping children upstairs who would wake up expecting breakfast and entertainment, while their grandmother potentially collapsed from whatever infection was attacking her 73-year-old immune system. I spent that night in the emergency room alone, taking an expensive taxi ride while my fever climbed to 102 degrees. The diagnosis was pneumonia, serious enough to require immediate antibiotic treatment and several days of rest, but not quite severe enough for hospital admission. The doctor, a kind woman in her 40s who reminded me of my younger self, looked concerned when I mentioned that I was responsible for 2 young children. "You need complete rest for at least 3 days," she said, writing prescriptions with careful precision. Pneumonia at your age is nothing to take lightly. Is there someone who can help with childcare while you recover? I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. The people who should have been helping me were spending their weekend at a luxury resort spa, considering my life-threatening illness an inconvenience that interfered with their prepaid relaxation. I returned to the house at 4 a.m., my chest aching and my head spinning from the strong antibiotics, to find Emma standing at the top of the basement stairs in her pajamas. "Grandma Dorothy? Where were you? I had a bad dream, and you weren't here." The guilt of my absence, combined with the reality of my situation, nearly broke me. Here was a 7-year-old girl who needed comfort and security, and I, sick as I was, represented the only stability she had while her parents prioritized their own pleasure over everyone else's well-being. I spent the weekend caring for Emma and Jake while battling pneumonia, my fever reducing my energy to almost nothing, while the children demanded constant attention. I made meals I couldn't taste, played games that exhausted me, and smiled through the pain because the alternative was allowing 2 innocent children to suffer for their parents' selfishness. When Marcus and Sarah returned Sunday evening, tanned and relaxed from their spa weekend, they found me collapsed on their living room couch, barely conscious from fever and exhaustion. "Mom, you look terrible," Sarah said, her voice carrying more annoyance than concern. "Did you take anything for that cough?" I wanted to scream that I'd had pneumonia, that I'd spent the weekend caring for their children while genuinely sick, that their dismissal of my illness had nearly resulted in serious consequences for my health. Instead, I whispered, "I saw a doctor." "It's pneumonia." Marcus frowned, checking his phone rather than looking at me. "Well, you should have mentioned it was that serious. We would have, I don't know, figured something out." But they wouldn't have figured anything out. They would have done exactly what they did, prioritized their own comfort while expecting me to manage their responsibilities regardless of my physical condition. That night, lying in my basement bed with my chest still tight and my breathing labored, I stared at the ceiling and finally acknowledged the truth I'd been avoiding for months. I wasn't family to them. I was infrastructure, like their heating system or their internet connection. Invisible when functioning properly, only noticed when breaking down, and expected to repair myself quickly so their comfortable life could continue uninterrupted. The realization didn't come as a sudden shock, but as a slow, devastating acceptance of reality. They didn't love me, they used me. They didn't appreciate my sacrifices. They expected them. They didn't see me as a person worthy of care and consideration. They saw me as a resource to be exploited until I was no longer useful. For the first time since moving into their basement, I allowed myself to imagine what my life might look like if I stopped being their unpaid staff and started being my own person again. The thought terrified me almost as much as it thrilled me. The morning after my pneumonia revelation, I did something I hadn't done in 18 months of basement living. I stayed in bed past 6 a.m. No breakfast preparation, no lunch packing, no morning routine that served everyone but myself. I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the chaos erupting upstairs as Marcus and Sarah discovered that their invisible infrastructure had malfunctioned. "Where's Mom?" Marcus's voice carried through the thin ceiling, tinged with the panic of someone whose comfortable routine had been disrupted. "Emma can't find her lunch money, and Jake's uniform isn't clean." "I don't know," Sarah replied, her heels clicking across the kitchen floor with increasing urgency. "She's always up by now. Maybe she's sick again?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Yesterday, pneumonia wasn't serious enough to interrupt their spa weekend. Today, my absence from unpaid labor duties constituted a household emergency worthy of immediate investigation. I heard Emma's voice, high and worried. "Daddy, where's Grandma Dorothy? She always makes my breakfast." "She'll be up in a minute, sweetheart," Marcus said, but his voice carried doubt. "Mommy will make your cereal today." Through my ceiling, I listened to Sarah's frustrated attempts to locate breakfast supplies that I organized, lunch containers that I washed, and the children's school papers that I kept filed in a system no one else understood. Drawers slammed, cabinet doors banged, and the coffee maker gurgled protests as someone tried to operate the machine they'd watched me use hundreds of times, but had never bothered to learn themselves. At 7:15 a.m., 45 minutes after their normal departure time, footsteps thundered down my basement stairs. Marcus appeared at my door without knocking, his designer suit wrinkled and his usually perfect hair disheveled. "Mom, what are you doing? The kids are going to be late for school. Sarah can't find anything, and I have a presentation at 9. I sat up slowly, pulling my robe around my shoulders with deliberate care. "I'm recovering from pneumonia, Marcus. The doctor said complete rest for several days. But you can't just disappear," he said, gesturing helplessly toward the chaos upstairs. "We need you. The kids need their routine. Need." The word hung between us like a confession. Not, "We love you," or "We're worried about you," or "How are you feeling?" Just need the honest acknowledgement that my value to them was purely functional. "I needed help this weekend, too," I said quietly. "I needed someone to care about whether I was seriously ill. I needed my family to prioritize my health over their vacation plans." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, checking his Rolex with the automatic gesture of someone who measures every conversation against his schedule. "Look, Mom, I'm sorry about the weekend. But this is different. This is the kids' education we're talking about. And this weekend was my life we were talking about." The silence stretched between us, filled with the sounds of Sarah's increasingly frantic search for items that I'd organized and maintained without recognition or appreciation. Emma's voice drifted down, asking why everything was so messy, why her lunch wasn't ready, why Daddy looked angry. "Can we discuss this tonight?" Marcus finally said. "I really can't be late for this presentation." He left without asking how I felt, whether I needed anything, or when I might be well enough to resume my duties. I was a malfunctioning appliance that would hopefully repair itself quickly so their lives could return to normal. But I didn't repair myself. Instead, I spent the day in bed, reading a library book I'd checked out weeks ago but had never found time to open. The simple act of doing something for my own pleasure, during hours when I would normally be cleaning their house and preparing their meals, felt both rebellious and deeply satisfying. When they returned from work and school that evening, I remained in my basement apartment, listening to their dinner conversation through the ceiling. Sarah had ordered pizza, expensive delivery pizza that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, because she couldn't figure out how to cook the chicken I'd been planning to prepare. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the thin floor. "We can't order takeout every night because your mother is having some kind of breakdown." Breakdown? As if my response to pneumonia and systematic exploitation was a mental health crisis, rather than a reasonable reaction to unreasonable treatment. "Maybe she just needs a few days," Marcus replied, but his tone suggested he was already losing patience with my recovery time. "She's always been dramatic about being sick. Always been dramatic." This from the man who called me to drive him to urgent care when he had a common cold, who expected homemade soup and constant attention whenever he felt slightly unwell. Emma's voice piped up. "Can we visit Grandma Dorothy? I want to show her my art project." "Not tonight, honey," Sarah said quickly. "Grandma needs rest. Besides, we don't want to catch whatever she has." But they hadn't been worried about catching anything when they needed me to babysit during my illness. Contagion was only a concern when it might inconvenience them, not when it might endanger the children I'd been caring for while fevering. The next morning brought another revelation. I woke to find a handwritten note slipped under my door. Sarah's perfect penmanship delivering instructions as if I were hired help rather than family. "Dorothy, Marcus and I need to attend a work function Friday evening. We'll need you to watch Emma and Jake from 6 p.m. to midnight. Please plan something fun for them. Also, the upstairs guest bathroom needs deep cleaning before my book club meets here Saturday. Thank you, Sarah." Not a request. Not, "Would you be willing?" or "If you're feeling better." Just expectations and instructions, delivered with the casual assumption that my time belonged to them regardless of my health or preferences. I held the note in my trembling hands, rereading the polite words that masked such profound disrespect. This was how they saw me. As staff who could be managed through written directives, whose illness was merely an inconvenience to be endured until normal service resumed. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in all my years of living in their house. I said no. When Sarah came home from her yoga class, I was sitting in their living room, still in my pajamas and robe, holding her note. "Sarah, I won't be available Friday evening, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm still recovering from pneumonia. She stopped in the doorway, her designer water bottle halfway to her lips, as if she hadn't quite processed what I'd said. I'm sorry? She said, her tone suggesting she'd misheard rather than that she disagreed. I said I won't be available to babysit Friday evening. I need to rest. Sarah's perfectly contoured face shifted through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, annoyance. Dorothy, this is really important. Marcus's boss will be there, and spouses are expected to attend. We've already RSVP'd. Then you'll need to hire a babysitter, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded despite my racing heart. Hire a babysitter? Sarah repeated, as if I'd suggested they hire a pilot to drive them to the grocery store. Why would we hire a babysitter when you live here? Because I'm not your employee, Sarah. I'm Marcus's mother, and I'm recovering from a serious illness. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge neither of us had expected. Sarah's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. But you always watch the kids when we need you to. It's part of our arrangement. What arrangement? I asked. I don't remember agreeing to be on call 24 hours a day. I don't remember signing a contract that made my health secondary to your social calendar. Sarah's composure cracked slightly, revealing the entitled frustration of someone unaccustomed to having their expectations challenged. I think you're being unreasonable. We've given you a place to live, and in return you help with the children. That's how families work. Families work by caring about each other's well-being, I replied. Families don't abandon each other during medical emergencies. Families don't treat pneumonia like an inconvenience. When Marcus came home an hour later, Sarah met him at the door with a whispered conference that I could hear clearly from the living room. Words like ungrateful and difficult and maybe we should reconsider drifted through their heated discussion. Marcus approached me with the measured calm of someone trying to negotiate with an unstable person. Mom, Sarah tells me you're refusing to watch the kids Friday night. I'm recovering from pneumonia, Marcus. I'm not refusing anything. I'm simply not available. But this is really important for my career. My boss expects to meet Sarah, and if we don't show up, then hire a babysitter, I said, repeating the solution that seemed so obvious to everyone except them. Do you know how much babysitters cost? Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. Especially for Friday night, last minute. Less than you spend on a single dinner at Giuseppe's, I replied. Less than Sarah spends on her monthly spa treatments. Less than you paid for one night at your Milwaukee resort. The comparison hung between us, highlighting the casual way they spent money on their own comfort while expecting free labor from the woman who'd financed their comfortable life. That's different, Marcus said weakly. How? He couldn't answer, because there was no reasonable explanation for why their entertainment budget was sacred while my health and dignity were expendable. That night, I lay in my basement bed listening to their muffled arguments through the ceiling. Sarah's voice carried clearly during the more heated moments. We can't let her think she can just dictate terms, and if she's going to live here, she needs to contribute. But for the first time since moving into their basement, I wasn't terrified by their anger. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. A small, fragile sense of my own worth, that their disapproval couldn't completely extinguish. Friday evening came, and they hired a babysitter, a 20-year-old college student who charged them $80 for 6 hours of work. As I watched Sarah count out the cash with obvious reluctance, I realized that my labor had been worth far more than they'd ever acknowledged. The babysitter arrived with energy and enthusiasm, playing games with Emma and Jake that had them laughing louder than I'd heard in months. She didn't clean their house or do their laundry or prepare elaborate meals. She simply focused on entertaining the children, treating babysitting as the part-time job it was, rather than the comprehensive domestic service I'd been providing. When Marcus and Sarah returned from their event, I heard them grudgingly admit that the evening had gone well, that the children had been happy, that perhaps hiring help wasn't as complicated as they'd imagined. But $80, Sarah complained as they paid the sitter. That's over $300 a month if we did this every weekend. $300 a month, less than they spent on Sarah's book club wine selections, less than Marcus's monthly car payment, Less than a single shopping trip to their organic grocery store. But somehow, paying me, their family member who'd invested thousands in their success, had never crossed their minds. That night, as their house settled into quiet, I sat in my rocking chair and whispered to Robert's photograph, "I think I'm finally ready to find out what I'm worth." 3 weeks after my first no, I woke up on a Tuesday morning with a startling realization. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something purely for my own joy. The thought hit me as I lay in my narrow basement bed, listening to the familiar sounds of Marcus and Sarah's morning routine above me, a routine that no longer included my automatic participation. They'd hired a cleaning service after I'd quietly stopped scrubbing their bathrooms and organizing their closets. The weekly cost was $200, money they'd found easily enough when my free labor was no longer available. I watched through my small basement window as the professional cleaners arrived each Thursday, their efficient movements completing in 3 hours what had taken me entire days to accomplish while juggling childcare and meal preparation. But this Tuesday morning felt different. The Chicago spring was finally showing itself after the brutal winter, and something in the gentle sunlight streaming through my window whispered possibilities I'd forgotten existed. I made coffee in my small kitchen area and sat at the card table that served as my dining room, breakfast nook, and office. For the first time in months, I didn't automatically calculate what needed to be done upstairs. Instead, I opened my laptop, a gift from Marcus 3 Christmases ago that I'd barely used, and searched for something I'd never thought to look for: activities for seniors in Chicago. The results overwhelmed me. Art classes at the Chicago Cultural Center, walking groups in Lincoln Park, book clubs at the public library, computer classes at the local community college, volunteer opportunities at the food bank, senior discount days at museums I'd always wanted to visit but had never found time for. Time. Such a foreign concept when you've spent 18 months being perpetually on call for other people's needs. I bookmarked a pottery class that met Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the Garfield Park Conservatory. The description mentioned therapeutic benefits of working with clay and supportive community for beginners. The cost was $35 for an 8-week session, less than Marcus spent on a single lunch at his downtown office. Before I could lose my nerve, I registered online, my fingers trembling slightly as I entered my credit card information. When was the last time I'd spent money on something that brought me joy rather than solving someone else's problem? The confirmation email felt like a small victory. Welcome to Pottery for Beginners. Class starts this Thursday at 10 a.m. Bring comfortable clothes and an open mind. I printed the email and taped it to my bathroom mirror, a daily reminder that Dorothy Chen was still capable of existing as her own person, not just as Marcus's mother or Emma and Jake's grandmother. That afternoon, I took the bus to the conservatory for a preliminary visit. I hadn't ridden public transportation in years, having become accustomed to Marcus driving me everywhere as part of their controlled management of my independence. But the number 20 bus was clean and efficient, filled with people of all ages going about their own business, pursuing their own purposes. The conservatory was breathtaking. A Victorian glass palace filled with tropical plants and the kind of peaceful beauty I'd forgotten existed beyond the utilitarian spaces of Marcus and Sarah's house. I walked through the palm house and the cactus room, breathing air that smelled of earth and growth, rather than the basement mustiness I'd grown accustomed to. In the pottery studio, I met Karen, the instructor, a woman in her early 60s with clay-stained fingers and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of someone who'd found genuine contentment in life's second half. "First time?" she asked, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed helping others discover new possibilities. "First time in many years," I admitted. "I used to do ceramics in high school, but that was, well, over 50 years ago." Karen smiled. "Muscle memory is amazing. Your hands will remember more than you think. Plus, clay is forgiving. You can always start over if something doesn't work out." Start over. The words resonated in ways Karen couldn't have intended. That Thursday, I attended my first pottery class in decades. My hands were awkward at first, unused to the gentle pressure required to shape clay without destroying it. But as the morning progressed, something magical happened. The quiet concentration required to center the clay on the wheel, to guide it into shape without forcing it, created a meditative space where the voices of criticism and obligation in my head finally fell silent. For 2 hours, I wasn't Marcus's mother, or Sarah's unpaid housekeeper, or Emma and Jake's on-call babysitter. I was simply Dorothy, learning to create something beautiful with my own hands, surrounded by other people who were there for the same pure reason, the joy of making something that hadn't existed before. "You have natural talent," Karen said, examining my first attempt. A slightly lopsided bowl that was nevertheless recognizably functional. "There's something peaceful about your approach to the clay. You're not fighting it. Fighting." I realized I'd been fighting everything for months. Fighting for recognition, fighting for respect, fighting to be seen as valuable. But here, with clay beneath my fingers, I didn't need to fight. I could simply be. The other students were a diverse group of retirees, empty nesters, and people like me who'd found themselves with unexpected time to rediscover forgotten interests. Margaret was a former accountant whose husband had passed 2 years earlier. James was a retired teacher exploring art after decades of lesson plans and standardized tests. Linda was a grandmother who'd decided to take up pottery after her daughter moved across the country. We shared coffee during the break, and I found myself talking about things other than my family's needs for the first time in years. We discussed the Cubs' prospects for the season, recommended books we'd enjoyed, shared frustrations about learning to use smartphones and streaming services. "It's funny," Margaret said, sipping coffee from a mug she'd made in a previous session. "I spent 40 years doing taxes for other people, and I never realized how much I missed creating things until my husband died, and I had to figure out who I was without taking care of him." Her words hit me with unexpected force. Who was I without taking care of Marcus and his family? What were my interests, my dreams, my preferences when they weren't filtered through everyone else's needs? That afternoon, I returned to the basement apartment feeling lighter than I had in months. The simple act of spending 2 hours focused on my own growth rather than someone else's convenience had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of what was possible. Marcus was waiting for me when I arrived, sitting on my small couch with the uncomfortable posture of someone invading a space he'd never bothered to truly see before. "Mom, where were you? Sarah tried calling and you didn't answer." I set down my purse, noting that my hands still smelled faintly of clay, a earthy, honest scent that seemed to ground me in this new version of myself. "I was at a pottery class," I said simply. "Pottery class?" Marcus repeated, as if I'd announced I was taking up lion taming. "Since when do you do pottery?" "Since today," I replied, hanging up my jacket with deliberate care. "I'm taking an 8-week course at the Garfield Park Conservatory." Marcus frowned, the expression he wore when his carefully organized world encountered unexpected variables. "But what if we need you? What if something comes up with the kids?" "Then you'll handle it," I said, surprised by how natural the words felt. The same way other parents handle unexpected situations. "But we're not other parents, Mom. We have you." Had. Past tense. As if my availability was a permanent condition, rather than a choice I'd been making out of love that had been transformed into obligation. "I'm taking the class on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to noon, I said. "You'll need to make alternative arrangements if you need childcare during those times." Alternative arrangements. The phrase felt revolutionary. The suggestion that my time had value, that my presence couldn't be assumed, that they might need to plan around my schedule rather than expecting me to accommodate theirs. "This is really inconvenient timing," Marcus said, checking his phone with the automatic gesture that meant he was already calculating how my new independence would affect his carefully managed life. "Sarah has her book club next Thursday morning, and someone needs to be here when the cable repair guy comes. Then one of you will need to take time off work," I said, "or reschedule the appointment, or hire someone to wait for the repair person." Marcus stared at me as if I'd suggested they burn down the house. "Take time off work? Mom, do you understand how important my job is? I can't just randomly take vacation days because you've decided to take up hobbies." Hobbies. As if my desire to grow and learn and exist as my own person was a frivolous indulgence rather than a basic human need. "Then hire someone," I repeated. "The same way you hired the cleaning service when I stopped being your unpaid housekeeper." The conversation ended with Marcus leaving in frustrated confusion, muttering about timing and inconvenience, as if my emergence as an independent person was a logistical problem he needed to solve, rather than a development he should celebrate. That evening, I sat in my rocking chair and examined my clay-stained fingernails, evidence of a day spent creating rather than serving. For the first time since moving into their basement, I felt proud of how I'd spent my time. The next morning brought another revelation. I woke up and, instead of automatically beginning the mental checklist of tasks that would serve Marcus's family, I thought about pottery, about the satisfying weight of clay in my hands, about the gentle guidance Karen had provided, about the peaceful community of people who gathered simply to create beautiful things. I thought about the bowl I was learning to make, imperfect but improving, shaped by patient attention rather than urgent demands. Much like the new version of myself I was discovering, one small choice at a time. When Sarah knocked on my door that afternoon with a list of errands she needed me to run, I looked at her through the screen and said, "I'm not available today. I'm reading." Reading. Such a simple act, but revolutionary when performed by someone who'd spent months having no time for her own interests. "Reading can wait," Sarah said, holding up her list with the assumption that her needs automatically took priority over my desires. "These errands can't." "Then you'll need to do them yourself," I said, returning to my book, a mystery novel I'd borrowed from the library, featuring a protagonist who solved problems with intelligence and courage rather than self-sacrifice. Sarah stood at my door for several long moments, apparently waiting for me to change my mind, to apologize for my selfishness, to return to the accommodating woman who'd made their lives so convenient. But I was done being convenient. I was learning to be valuable, to myself first, and to others only when that value was recognized and respected. As Sarah's footsteps retreated up the basement stairs, I smiled and turned the page. The protagonist had just discovered an important clue that would change everything. I knew exactly how she felt. The explosion came on a rainy Saturday morning in May, 6 weeks after I'd started pottery class, and 4 weeks after I'd begun what Marcus called my selfish phase. I was sitting at my small table, reading the Chicago Tribune and enjoying my coffee at my own pace, when the basement door flew open with a violence that made the hinges protest. Marcus stormed down the stairs, followed by Sarah and, to my surprise, Sarah's mother, Patricia, a woman who'd never visited our house before, but had apparently been summoned for this intervention. Their faces carried the grim determination of people who'd reached their limit and were prepared to take decisive action. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the forced authority of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "This has gone far enough." I set down my newspaper slowly, noting how they'd positioned themselves between me and the stairs, blocking my exit as if I were a flight risk rather than a 73-year-old woman drinking coffee in her own living space. "Good morning, Marcus." "Sarah, Patricia," I said, my voice steadier than my racing heart. "This is unexpected." Patricia stepped forward, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon, and her silver hair styled in the kind of perfect waves that require weekly salon maintenance. She'd never spoken to me directly in all the years I'd known her, communicating with me only through Sarah when absolutely necessary. "Dorothy, dear," she began, her voice dripping with the condescending sweetness that wealthy women use when addressing service workers. "Sarah has been telling me about your recent behavior. We're all concerned about you." Behavior. As if my decision to live as an independent human being was a symptom of mental illness rather than a reasonable response to years of exploitation. "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, though I knew exactly what this was about. The previous week had been a series of small rebellions that had apparently added up to a crisis requiring family intervention. Monday, I'd refused to babysit Emma and Jake so Marcus and Sarah could attend a last-minute work dinner, suggesting they hire the college babysitter they'd used before. Tuesday, I'd attended pottery class instead of staying home to wait for the appliance repair technician, forcing Sarah to rearrange her yoga schedule. Wednesday, I'd informed them I'd be visiting my sister Eleanor in Milwaukee for the weekend without asking permission or checking their calendar first. Thursday, I'd declined to prepare dinner for the family, explaining that I'd eaten at the senior center after pottery class and wasn't hungry. Friday, I'd gone to the library and then to see a matinee movie, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, which felt wonderfully relevant to my current situation, instead of being available for the spontaneous errands that used to consume my days. Each small assertion of independence had been met with increasing frustration from Marcus and Sarah, culminating in what I now realized had been planning sessions for this confrontation. "Mom," Marcus said, pulling out his phone and consulting what appeared to be a list of grievances. "In the past month, you've been completely unreliable. You're never available when we need you. You've abandoned your responsibilities to this family." "What responsibilities?" I asked. "I was never hired as your nanny or housekeeper. I was invited to live here as family." "Exactly," Sarah interjected, her voice rising with the passion of someone who'd been building this argument for weeks. "Family helps family. Family doesn't suddenly become selfish and demanding." "Demanding?" I repeated. "I haven't demanded anything except the right to make my own schedule." Patricia cleared her throat with the authority of someone accustomed to settling disputes through pronouncement rather than discussion. "Dorothy, I think you're having some kind of midlife crisis. It's not uncommon for women your age to become confused about their priorities." "I'm 73, Patricia. If this is a midlife crisis, I'm expecting to live to 146. My attempted humor was met with 3 stern faces that suggested this was no laughing matter. "Mom, this isn't funny," Marcus said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when explaining financial concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior. "We've been talking, and we think you might be depressed, or maybe experiencing some kind of cognitive decline. Normal people don't suddenly change their entire personality at your age." Cognitive decline. The words hit me like physical blows, reducing my newfound independence to symptoms of mental deterioration. In their minds, a 73-year-old woman who asserted herself was by definition mentally impaired. "I'm not depressed or cognitively impaired," I said, my voice gaining strength from the insult. "I'm simply no longer willing to be your unpaid staff." "Unpaid staff?" Sarah's voice reached a register that made her sound like a teenager being accused of something unfair. "You live here rent-free. You eat our food. We pay for your utilities." "I live in your basement," I corrected. "I eat my own food that I buy with my own money, and I've been calculating my contributions to this household. Would you like to see the numbers?" I stood up and walked to my dresser, pulling out the notebook where I'd been documenting my financial and labor contributions since my pneumonia revelation. Marcus tried to look over my shoulder as I opened it, but I held it at an angle that protected my privacy. "In the 18 months I've lived here," I began, reading from my careful calculations, "I've provided approximately 1,200 hours of childcare. At Chicago's average babysitting rate of $15 per hour, that's $18,000 in unpaid services." Sarah's mouth opened to protest, but I continued reading. "I've prepared approximately 400 meals for your family. At the cost of meal delivery services you regularly use, that's roughly $6,000 in unpaid cooking services." "Mom, that's ridiculous," Marcus interrupted. "You can't put a price on family help. I've cleaned your house weekly for 18 months, I continued, ignoring his interruption. "Professional cleaning services charge $200 per week, which equals $15,600 in unpaid housekeeping." The numbers hung in the air between us, transforming my free housing into the illusion it had always been. I hadn't been living rent-free. I'd been working for substantially below minimum wage while being gaslit into believing I was receiving charity. "And in the same 18 months," I said, closing the notebook with finality, "I've contributed $12,000 to your household expenses from my Social Security and savings. Groceries, utilities, children's supplies, and emergency funds when you needed them." Patricia's perfectly composed expression flickered slightly as she processed the mathematics of my exploitation. "The total value of my contributions to this household is $51,600, I concluded. "In exchange, I've received housing in your basement and the privilege of being treated like incompetent help." "Those numbers are manipulated," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're making this sound like some kind of business transaction, isn't it?" I asked. You just finished telling me that I live here rent-free in exchange for helping the family. That sounds like a business transaction to me. A very unfavorable one from my perspective. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, the gesture he'd used since childhood when cornered by logic he couldn't dispute. Mom, you're twisting everything. We love you. We want you here. You want my services here, I corrected. You want the convenience I provide. But love doesn't involve treating someone like invisible infrastructure. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Patricia announced, as if my mathematical accuracy had confirmed her worst suspicions. She's clearly having some kind of psychological episode. We need to consider alternative arrangements. Alternative arrangements. The threat hung in the air like a sword over my head. The implicit suggestion that if I didn't return to compliant servitude, I'd be removed from their home entirely. What kind of alternative arrangements? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Sarah and Marcus exchanged a look that confirmed they'd discussed this possibility in detail. There's a very nice assisted living facility in Schaumburg, Sarah said, her voice taking on the artificially gentle tone people use when delivering devastating news. It has excellent reviews, and they specialize in seniors who are transitioning. Transitioning. A euphemism for warehousing elderly people whose families found them inconvenient. I'm not transitioning anywhere, I said, my voice carrying a firmness that surprised even me. I'm not mentally impaired. I don't need assistance with daily living, and I'm certainly not going to be shipped off to a facility because I've become inconvenient. But Mom, Marcus said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he'd used as a child when trying to negotiate his way out of consequences. You're clearly not happy here anymore. Maybe you'd be better off with people your own age, doing activities designed for seniors. I do activities designed for seniors, I said. Pottery class, library book club, volunteer work at the food bank. The difference is, I choose these activities because they bring me joy, not because someone else has decided they're appropriate for my demographic. The mention of my volunteer work seemed to catch them off guard. I'd started helping at the Greater Chicago Food Depository 2 weeks earlier, using my car to deliver meals to homebound seniors. The work was meaningful, appreciated, and had introduced me to a community of people who valued contribution without expecting servitude. Volunteer work? Patricia asked, as if I'd announced I was running for mayor. When do you have time for volunteer work? When I'm not being your unpaid domestic staff, I replied. The silence that followed was heavy with calculation. I could see them reassessing their position, realizing that my transformation wasn't a temporary rebellion, but a permanent reclamation of my autonomy. Finally, Marcus played what I realized was their final card. Mom, if you're not willing to be part of this family anymore, then maybe you should find somewhere else to live. The ultimatum hung between us like a challenge. Return to invisible servitude or lose your home, your proximity to your grandchildren, your last remaining family connections. I looked at the three faces staring at me expectantly, waiting for me to crumble under the threat of abandonment, to choose security over dignity, to sacrifice my newly discovered self-worth for the illusion of belonging. Instead, I walked to my closet and pulled out the suitcase I'd bought the week before. A small act of preparation that had felt both hopeful and terrifying. You're absolutely right, I said, setting the suitcase on my bed and opening it with deliberate calm. I should find somewhere else to live. Somewhere I'm treated like family instead of a convenience. Somewhere my presence is valued rather than just utilized. The shocked silence that followed suggested they'd expected capitulation, not acceptance of their ultimatum. Mom, wait, Marcus said, his voice suddenly uncertain. I didn't mean, we don't want you to actually leave. Yes, you do, I said, folding my clothes with the same methodical care I'd used for their laundry countless times. You want the compliant version of me to stay. You want the woman who never says no, never has her own plans, never expects to be treated with respect. But that woman doesn't exist anymore. As I packed my belongings, surprised by how few possessions I'd accumulated in 18 months of living in their basement, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, pride in my own strength. For the first time since Robert's death, I was choosing my own future instead of accepting whatever others decided I deserved, and it felt like coming alive again. 3 months after I packed my suitcase and walked out of Marcus's house with my head held high, I woke up in my studio apartment in Andersonville to the sound of children playing in the courtyard below. But instead of the familiar ache of loss that had accompanied such sounds for weeks, I felt something entirely different: contentment. My new apartment was smaller than the basement space I'd left behind, but it was mine. Every corner reflected choices I'd made for myself: the cheerful yellow curtains I'd sewn in my pottery class's sewing workshop, the small bookshelf filled with novels I'd chosen from the library's donation sale, the tiny kitchen where I cooked meals for one without apologizing for my preferences or accommodating anyone else's dietary demands. The rent was $800 a month, manageable with my Social Security and the part-time income I'd started earning as a companion for elderly clients through Senior Angels, a service that connected older adults who needed assistance with those who could provide it. The work was everything my unpaid labor for Marcus had not been: appreciated, compensated, and performed with clear boundaries and mutual respect. My first client was Helen Morrison, an 84-year-old former librarian whose arthritis made grocery shopping difficult, but whose mind remained sharp as a razor. We met 3 times a week. I'd drive her to appointments, help with heavy housework, and often stay for tea while she regaled me with stories from her 40 years working at the Harold Washington Library. "You know, Dorothy," Helen said during one of our Tuesday visits, "I can't understand why your family let you get away. If I had someone as capable and kind as you, I'd be bragging about her to everyone I met. Capable and kind. Such simple words, but they carried weight I'd forgotten I possessed. At Marcus and Sarah's house, my capabilities had been invisible until absent, my kindness taken for granted until withdrawn. Here, with Helen and my other clients, both qualities were recognized, valued, and appropriately compensated. My pottery had evolved from therapeutic hobby to genuine artistic expression. Karen had encouraged me to enter a piece in the Garfield Park Conservatory's summer show, a series of small bowls I'd created during my weeks of emotional turmoil, their imperfect forms somehow capturing the beauty that could emerge from brokenness. "These pieces tell a story," Karen had said, examining my work with the serious attention of someone who understood that art could be autobiography. "There's pain in them, but also hope, resilience. They're not trying to be perfect. They're trying to be honest. Honest." I'd spent so many years trying to be perfect for people who would never appreciate perfection, who would always find new ways to express dissatisfaction regardless of my efforts. Creating art that embraced imperfection felt revolutionary. The opening reception for the pottery show was held on a warm July evening, the conservatory's glass walls reflecting the golden hour light while visitors moved between displays of ceramics created by students from across the city. I wore a dress I'd bought for the occasion. Not expensive, but chosen because I loved its deep blue color and the way it made me feel confident rather than invisible. To my shock, Marcus appeared near my display just as I was explaining my work to a young couple who'd been admiring the bowls. "Mom?" he said, his voice uncertain, as if he wasn't quite sure he was addressing the right person. I excused myself from the conversation and turned to face my son, noting how out of place he looked in his expensive business suit among the casual art enthusiasts and pottery students. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice neutral, "this is unexpected." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes taking in my confident posture, my new dress, the small crowd that had gathered around my artwork. Sarah saw a mention of the show in the Tribune. She recognized your name. They'd been checking up on me. The knowledge that they'd been tracking my activities while maintaining no direct contact felt both invasive and oddly satisfying. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Karen gave me your address," he admitted. "I told her I was your son and that we'd lost touch." Lost touch. Such a gentle euphemism for the ultimatum they'd delivered and the choice I'd made to accept it. "You look," he started, then stopped, apparently struggling to find words for the transformation he was witnessing. "Happy?" I suggested. "Different," he said, confident. Like you used to be when I was little." The observation caught me off guard. I'd forgotten that Marcus had once known me as a complete person, rather than just a source of unpaid services. "How are Emma and Jake?" I asked, because despite everything, they remained my grandchildren, and I loved them. They miss you, Marcus said. And for the first time since his arrival, his voice carried genuine emotion. Emma asks about you constantly. She wants to know why you can't come to her recital next month, why you don't answer when she calls your old phone number. The old phone number. I'd changed it when I moved, needing a clean break from the constant expectation that I'd be available for every crisis and convenience. I miss them too, I said honestly, but I won't return to the situation I left. I won't be treated like household staff in exchange for limited access to my grandchildren. Marcus looked around the conservatory, taking in the evidence of my new life, the art I'd created, the friends who'd stopped by to congratulate me, the obvious joy I took in this community I'd discovered. Sarah thought you'd come back by now, he said quietly. She said you'd realize you needed us more than we needed you. The casual cruelty of the observation, that they'd expected my independence to fail, that they'd been waiting for desperation to drive me back to them, clarified any lingering doubts I might have had about my decision. I've realized a lot of things, I said. None of them involve needing to be treated badly in order to have a relationship with my family. Mom, I know we made mistakes, Marcus said, his voice taking on the pleading tone that had worked on me for so many years. Maybe we took you for granted, but we can work things out. We miss having you around. You miss my services, I corrected. You miss the convenience I provided. But you never missed me as a person, because you never saw me as one. The words hung between us while the sounds of the reception continued around us. Conversations about art and creativity, laughter from people who were celebrating beauty and accomplishment rather than negotiating family dysfunction. That's not true, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. When was the last time you asked about my interests, my dreams, my feelings about anything that didn't directly relate to your convenience? I asked. When was the last time you treated me like someone whose thoughts and preferences mattered? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, apparently unable to recall a single example. I need to ask you to leave, I said, not with anger, but with the calm authority of someone who'd learned to protect her own peace. This is my evening, my achievement, my community. You're not welcome here unless you can celebrate my success without trying to manipulate me into serving yours. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally seeing the woman who'd raised him rather than the diminished version he'd become accustomed to exploiting. I never meant for it to be this way, he said finally. Maybe not, I replied, but this is how it became, and I'm not willing to pretend otherwise anymore. After he left, I returned to the reception with a lightness I hadn't expected. Several people approached to ask about my conversation with that intense man in the suit, and I found myself explaining that I'd recently ended a toxic relationship that had been consuming my energy and preventing me from pursuing my own growth. It wasn't untrue, even if the relationship had been with my son rather than a romantic partner. Helen Morrison arrived near the end of the evening, moving slowly but determinedly through the conservatory with her walker, her eyes bright with curiosity about this world I'd described but she'd never seen. Dorothy, these are magnificent, she said, examining my bowls with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades helping people discover literature and art. They're honest in a way that most art isn't. They don't try to hide their imperfections. They celebrate them. That's what I was going for, I said, surprised by how natural it felt to discuss my artistic intentions with someone who took my work seriously. You know, Helen said, accepting the cup of punch I'd brought her, I've been thinking about what you told me about your family situation, about feeling invisible and unappreciated. I nodded, remembering the many conversations we'd had while I helped her organize her apartment or drove her to medical appointments. I think you were grieving, she continued, not just for your husband, but for the version of yourself that died when you stopped being seen as a whole person. Tonight, watching you with your art and your friends, I think I'm seeing that person come back to life, coming back to life. The phrase resonated with startling accuracy. For months, I'd been thinking about my transformation as becoming someone new, but Helen was right. I was becoming someone I'd once been, but had lost along the way. The woman who'd taught piano lessons and balanced household budgets with creative ingenuity. The woman who'd driven cross-country to see the Grand Canyon on her 40th birthday. The woman who'd negotiated her husband's medical care with fierce advocacy and tender love. The woman who'd raised Marcus to be kind and responsible, even if those lessons hadn't taken root as deeply as I'd hoped. As the reception wound down and I helped clean up, surrounded by people who'd become genuine friends rather than obligations, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about the future. Not anxiety about what others might need from me. Not dread about how I might disappoint someone, but genuine anticipation for the possibilities that lay ahead. I had plans, pottery classes to continue, clients to serve, books to read, places to explore. I had choices about how to spend my time, my energy, my affection. I had a life that belonged to me, shaped by my preferences and priorities rather than everyone else's convenience. That night, I sat in my small apartment with a cup of tea and one of my imperfect, honest bowls, watching the city lights twinkle beyond my window. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt complete. Not because someone else was taking care of me, but because I'd learned to take care of myself with the same fierce devotion I'd once lavished on people who'd never fully appreciated it. I was Dorothy Chen again, not Marcus's mother or Emma and Jake's grandmother, or anyone's unpaid domestic worker. Just Dorothy, discovering what she was capable of when finally given the chance to find out. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my new one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Square, preparing dinner for 3, myself, Helen Morrison, who'd become like a sister to me, and Emma, my granddaughter, who was spending her first weekend with me since I'd reclaimed my life. The apartment was bright and airy, with hardwood floors and windows that faced east toward the lake. I'd been able to afford the upgrade after my pottery began selling at local craft fairs, and my companion service business had grown to include 6 regular clients. The walls displayed my ceramic pieces alongside photographs from the senior travel group I'd joined. Images of our trip to Door County, our visit to the Art Institute, our afternoon at Navy Pier, where a group of women over 60 had ridden the Ferris wheel and laughed like teenagers. "Grandma Dorothy, can I help?" Emma asked, standing on the step stool I'd bought specifically for her visits. At 8 years old, she was more observant than I'd remembered, more thoughtful, less influenced by her parents' casual dismissal of people they considered inconvenient. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, handing her a wooden spoon. "You can help me stir the sauce." The change in our relationship had been gradual but profound. After 6 months of no contact, Marcus had finally agreed to my terms for seeing the children. Supervised visits in neutral locations, with clear time boundaries and no expectation that I would provide free childcare or domestic services. What started as awkward meetings at parks and museums had evolved into genuine connections as Emma and Jake got to know me as a person rather than just a service provider. "Mom says you live alone now because you wanted to," Emma said, concentrating on her stirring with the serious attention she brought to everything she considered important. "That's right," I said. "Sometimes adults need space to grow and learn new things, just like kids do. Like when I went to sleepaway camp and was scared at first, but then loved it." "Exactly like that." Emma nodded solemnly. "Mom said you were being selfish, but I think you were being brave. Out of the mouths of babes." This 8-year-old understood something her father still struggled to grasp, that choosing yourself isn't selfish when everyone else has been choosing themselves at your expense for years. Helen arrived at 6, moving more slowly than she had the previous year, but still sharp as ever, carrying a bottle of wine and the latest mystery novel she'd finished. "Dorothy, this smells divine," she said, settling into the chair I'd designated as hers during our regular dinner visits. "Emma, your grandmother is the best cook I know. You're very lucky." "I know," Emma said seriously. "She makes everything from scratch. Not like the frozen stuff Mom buys." The casual comparison wasn't lost on me. In my new life, I cooked because I enjoyed it, experimenting with recipes and techniques I'd never had time to explore when my kitchen time was consumed by feeding others' preferences. Emma had noticed the difference between food prepared with joy and meals assembled from convenience. Over dinner, Helen entertained us with stories from her library days while Emma shared updates from school and her new piano lessons, taught by a professional instructor whose expertise was valued because Marcus and Sarah paid for it. Unlike the grandmother who'd offered to teach her for free, Grandma Dorothy, Emma said as we cleared the dinner dishes. "Why don't you come to our house anymore?" It was the question I'd been expecting, the one that required an answer honest enough for an 8-year-old to understand without being cruel enough to damage her relationship with her parents. "Sometimes families grow apart when they want different things," I said carefully. "Your parents wanted me to live with them in a way that made me unhappy. I needed to find a way to be happy again. But you still love us, right?" "Oh, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to her level. "I will always love you and Jake. That will never change. But loving someone doesn't mean accepting treatment that hurts you. It's okay to love people and still protect yourself." Emma considered this with the gravity she brought to complex concepts. "Like how I love Jessica, but I don't let her copy my homework anymore because it's not fair to me?" Exactly like that. After Emma went to bed in the small second bedroom I'd furnished specifically for the children's visits, Helen and I sat in my living room with tea, surrounded by the quiet contentment of a home built around my own preferences rather than others' demands. "She's a smart child," Helen observed. "She understands more than her parents give her credit for." "She does," I agreed. "I think she's learning things about relationships and boundaries that I never taught Marcus. Maybe that's part of why this happened, so she could learn to value herself in ways I failed to model." "You're modeling it now," Helen pointed out. "She's seeing what it looks like when a woman chooses her own happiness over others' convenience." That's a valuable lesson. The next morning, as I was braiding Emma's hair before Marcus came to pick her up, she surprised me with a question that revealed how much she'd internalized from our weekend together. "Grandma Dorothy, if someone makes you feel bad about yourself, is it okay to stop spending time with them even if they're family?" I paused in my braiding, understanding that this wasn't just curiosity, but a real situation she was navigating in her 8-year-old world. "Yes, Emma. It's always okay to protect your feelings, even from family. Family love should make you feel good about yourself, not bad, even if they say they love you. Especially then. People who really love you want you to be happy and healthy. They don't make you feel small or unimportant." She nodded thoughtfully, and I wondered what dynamics she was observing in her parents' house, what lessons she was learning about how people treat each other when they think no one is paying attention. When Marcus arrived to collect Emma, he lingered in my doorway with an awkwardness that had become familiar during our limited interactions. The arrogant man who delivered ultimatums in my basement apartment had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely confused by the consequences of his own actions. "She talks about you constantly," he said, watching Emma gather her small overnight bag. "About your pottery, your friends, your apartment. You seem happy." "I am happy," I said simply. "Sarah keeps asking when you're going to come back," he continued. "She says this has gone on long enough." The casual assumption that my independence was a temporary tantrum, rather than a permanent lifestyle choice, revealed how little they'd learned from our separation. "I'm not coming back, Marcus," I said, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who'd found her path and intended to stay on it. "This isn't a negotiation or a punishment. This is my life now, but we're family," he said, the phrase that had once been my weakness now holding no power over my decisions. "Yes, we are. And I hope someday you'll understand that family means celebrating each other's happiness, not resenting each other's independence." 3 months later, I received an unexpected phone call from Sarah. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, less commanding than I remembered. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something," she began, dispensing with pleasantries in a way that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "What can I do for you, Sarah? My mother is sick. Cancer. She's going to need help, and Marcus and I both work full-time, and the kids have school." She trailed off, and I understood what she was really asking. Not for my help exactly, but for my forgiveness, my return to the role of family problem solver who would sacrifice her own life to manage everyone else's crises. "I'm sorry to hear about Patricia's diagnosis," I said, and I meant it. Cancer was a terrible thing regardless of my complicated relationship with my former daughter-in-law's mother. "We were wondering, maybe you could come back just temporarily. We could pay you this time for helping with Mom." Pay me. The offer that should have come years earlier when my labor was being exploited rather than when they desperately needed something I might provide. Sarah, I said gently, I hope you find the help Patricia needs. There are excellent companion services in Chicago. I can give you some references, but I won't be returning to your house under any circumstances. But she's family too now, Sarah protested. And you're so good at this kind of thing. I'm good at it because I choose to do it for people who appreciate it, I replied. I have 6 clients who value my services enough to compensate me fairly and treat me with respect. I'm not interested in returning to a situation where my help was expected rather than appreciated. The conversation ended with Sarah's frustrated goodbye, and I realized that some people never learn to distinguish between love and service, between family and exploitation. 6 months after that call, Emma wrote me a letter in her careful 3rd-grade handwriting. Dear Grandma Dorothy, I am learning piano really good, but I wish you could teach me too. Mom hired a lady to help with Great-Grandma Patricia, but she's not as nice as you and costs lots of money. I think Mom and Dad are starting to understand why you had to take care of yourself. I love you, Emma. I framed that letter and hung it next to my pottery display, a reminder that the lessons we teach aren't always the ones we intend, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is show others what self-respect looks like. Today, as I sit in my bright apartment preparing for another pottery class, another dinner with Helen, another weekend visit from Emma and Jake, I think about the woman I was 2 years ago. The woman who whispered, "Was I used?" into the darkness of a basement apartment, who accepted crumbs of affection in exchange for exhausting labor, who believed that her value depended on her usefulness to people who would never appreciate her sacrifice. That woman was drowning in other people's expectations, suffocating under the weight of obligations that were never truly mutual. She was dying by degrees. One ignored birthday, one unpaid bill, one whispered insult at a time. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, life gives you the opportunity to save yourself. Sometimes the people who hurt you provide the very crisis that forces you to choose between continuing to accept unacceptable treatment and discovering who you are when you finally say no. The woman who couldn't even get in the car alone has driven herself to Door County, to pottery classes, to art galleries and concerts and places that feed her soul rather than drain it. She's learned that she was never the problem. She was simply solving the wrong equation, trying to earn love from people who had decided her value was purely functional. The truth is this: I was never the woman who couldn't get in the car alone. I was the woman who got out of the car, walked away from the whispers and the contempt, and discovered that the life waiting for her on the other side of that door was more beautiful than anything she'd ever imagined. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered if you're being taken for granted by the people you love most? Comment below and tell me your story, because sometimes the first step toward change is simply admitting that change is needed. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to choose yourself, to demand respect, to walk away from people who see you as a convenience rather than a treasure, because you are a treasure, and you deserve to be treated like one.